last class. Okay, I believe the glitch with the Blackboard PowerPoints has been resolved. All of the PowerPoints are now in a folder in the course documents area of Blackboard for the final, so including today's. So when we left off last time, I had been talking to you about Brunelleschi's approach to tectonic expression in the old sacristy at San Lorenzo. And I'm just going to speed through some of these slides as a reminder of where we were, what we were talking about, emphasizing Brunelleschi's decision to rely upon perfect geometries like squares and circles to give coherence to his spatial schemes. And also we talked about how he used material to represent a structure that could also give coherence to the space. And we talked about the various details of the Pietra Serena, including the brackets on the side wall, and also the use of the bracket in the place of a keystone in the arch in the back of the chapel of this room. And other aspects of this that I think are significant include his decision to split the pilaster in the corner. You see that in the very corner, he's defining the corner with a pilaster that represents a corner support. And he bends that pilaster exactly in half with the same number of flutes on one side of the corner as on the other side. I'm not going to lecture extensively on this. It's in the book, but I want to point your attention to the fact that when historians compare this work to the Pazzi Chapel, which is also attributed to Brunelleschi, these standards, this kind of discipline and rigor that Brunelleschi applied to this space isn't in evidence. And so it's a reason why some historians have questioned the attribution of the Pazzi Chapel to Brunelleschi. Like I said, that's discussed in the book. But so you can see here that he's using these materials to kind of knit together all the different parts of this space. And this is a great slide actually to connect it back to the Medici, who were important patrons of this space, and also of the building of San Lorenzo. Their family emblem, which is also known as a coat of arms, is in the corner here, just in the pendentive of the dome. You can see this gold shield that has red balls on it. That is the Medici family emblem. And this emblem appears all over the city of Florence, and it's a way for the family to mark its contribution to the city. It's almost like putting your name very large on a building so that people know that you were the patron of it. And so this is a kind of early example of this from the 15th century. It was very bold actually, because during this period there was an understanding that patrons, while they wanted to assert their identity and make sure that people associated their projects with them and their family, it was kind of considered vulgar to be too emphatic about that, or almost arrogant to be too emphatic about that. And so this is a very early instance of an individual family putting their emblem in a very prominent place. So we're starting to see that attitude about modest patronage shift. And that's a very important point here at the old sacristy. I want to zoom ahead and talk also about another aspect of the sacristy that is connected to the Medici. So I told you that the sacristy is a place where priests, where the clergy would store their ritual clothing, their vestments, and the various instruments that were used in the ritual. But it was also a place where the Medici actually located some of their burial for their family members. And an interesting aspect of this is that the head of the Medici family placed his burial spot, his sarcophagus, his coffin, directly under the dome of this building, or of this space. And so what you're seeing here, this is the dome of that small chapel, and then this is the dome of that main space. Directly underneath that space was his tomb. And interesting about this is that above that tomb, on the exterior of the space, there was the dome, and at the apex of that dome was a lantern. This structure that you see here on your left with these columns that projects up from the dome, that's called a lantern. Many people from the period made a connection between the form of that lantern and the form of the pinnacle of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Now I want you to think about what this might signify during this period. Think back to when we were looking at early Christian architecture and the identity of the Holy Sepulchre was believed to be the place where Jesus was buried. And this structure that you're seeing here on the right, this projection, was a way of marking from the outside that powerful symbolic axis from the burial place up to the lantern of the Holy Sepulchre. Imagine what it means when you have a structure in 15th century Florence where there's a burial place under a dome, and the vertical axis of that dome ends in a lantern whose source is the Holy Sepulchre. That's a pretty nervy, that's a pretty bold architectural gesture. And so it gives you a sense of the Medici kind of trafficking in this architectural symbolism, asserting their identity more and more, even in the 15th century. It's going to be a long time, several decades, before the Medici actually end up taking over the city of Florence. But in that interim, they begin to make these very powerful gestures that would not have been ignored by their contemporaries. Brunelleschi, of course, also worked on the Church of San Lorenzo. And this is one of those projects where he began the project, but he didn't finish it. He was fired off of this project because it was taking too long. And he was succeeded by the Medici architect Michelozzo. So one of the things that I told you when we began talking about the Renaissance is that we always have to ask ourselves, when we are looking at a Renaissance building and we know that people are looking at the classical past as a source, we want to ask which classical past. In the case of Brunelleschi, he was looking at an early Christian basilica. If you look at the organization of this interior, you can see that really clearly. There's an arcade carried on columns, so we would call it a colonnade, an arcade that carries these arches. There's a clear story above. It's a very clear basilica plan. Obviously, he interpreted it by adding the various chapels along the nave and around the transept, but the source is very clearly an early Christian basilica. And just to kind of drive home that point, I have this comparison for you between San Lorenzo, Brunelleschi's plan for San Lorenzo, and the interior of an early Christian church, San Paolo Fuori le Mura in Rome. The model, I think, is very, very clear here. Interesting about Brunelleschi, we've been talking about the ways in which he identified ordering systems that would make his buildings coherent and legible to someone who could visually understand them and emphasize the thought and intellectualization of the space that they're in, kind of understand the order by verifying it with their eyes. Brunelleschi is widely credited with initiating a system of one-point perspective. People have been experimenting with one-point perspective for a very long time, with very mixed results, I would say. And Brunelleschi actually undertook a kind of experiment. I'm going to come back to this slide. He went to the door of the cathedral and used a kind of mirror, a reflective surface with a hole in it, to generate a grid with orthogonals and a horizon line and a vanishing point. He used that grid to render three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. This process of using the grid and the horizon line, the orthogonals, etc., the transversals, was actually written down in a treatise by Alberti and widely disseminated. And with the initiation of this system, the rendering of three-dimensional space in Renaissance painting became much more commonplace. I would say that it was the standard. People would use this system to represent three-dimensional space. Well, if you are thinking about this building, San Lorenzo, and Brunelleschi's work in it, you might think to yourself, architecture, the experience of architecture is a three-dimensional experience. So this issue of perspective is not very critical. But in fact, Brunelleschi wanted to use this material, Pietra Serena, to reinforce people's understanding of three-dimensional space. And so the order, the proportions, the geometries of this organization of the space inside San Lorenzo was meant to underline this experience, this knowledge of the order of space, so that you could read it while you were experiencing it. So an example of this can be seen if you stand in the center axis of the nave of San Lorenzo and you turn toward the aisle. Basically, he has set up the elements of the view from the nave to the chapel so that they all line up and reinforce your reading of perspectival space. So you can see that he, including kind of emphasizing these elements using the gray Pietra Serena for the columns, the pilasters, the molding that articulates the entry into the chapel. He steps up the chapel to reinforce your idea of those, or reading of those kinds of transversal, the orthogonals that run toward the vanishing point. And even in the very back of the chapel, you can see that there's molding here that reinforces that reading. So it all lines up perfectly so that you can read it. He didn't have to do that. You would still obviously be in a three-dimensional space, but he's using the material again to make the whole system cohere and to allow you to read that coherence. And here's just a view down the aisle, kind of reinforcing the ways in which these forms, even at the end of the aisle, kind of emphasize that idea of the vanishing point at the back of the church. So just another view. It's lined up a little bit better there so that you can see it. Now, Brunelleschi, as I said, was fired from this job. He wasn't getting it done quickly enough, and the Medici were getting impatient. They wanted to finish this church and get on with other projects that they wanted to patronize. And so his replacement was the architect Michelozzo. And we've been talking about these various systems that Brunelleschi has been using. They seem very straightforward, they seem rather simple, but as we saw at the Foundling Hospital, that it's not always so easy to execute if you don't really understand the system itself. Michelozzo clearly did not, and so he took on Brunelleschi's language of plaster and Pietra Serena, but he used it in a much less rigorous, disciplined way. And one place where you can really see that happening is in the corner of the transept, where we know Michelozzo was working. And there are a few elements here that I think you can probably read on your own. For example, Michelozzo sees that Brunelleschi has used these brackets in this tectonic way in the old sacristy, and he desires to apply them in San Lorenzo. But you guys can see that this span does not require a bracket. It should be supported by colossal pilasters on either end. This is the area that Michelozzo was responsible for, so you can see that he doesn't exactly execute the system properly. In the absence of a colossal pilaster in the back, he places this bracket or console, and he does this all over the place in San Lorenzo in places that it doesn't belong. And you can see it not only here, but also here. Why would you need a bracket there? It just doesn't make sense. So he's using them in a decorative way, not in a rigorous tectonic way. This corner also is basically a disaster. You can see how the arches, because Michelozzo did not proportion them properly, the arches do not resolve on the support below them that is supposed to be supporting them. So if you look here, you can see that the arch runs into the pilaster. Here, the arch runs into the corner. And here we have this little nose of a pilaster there. I don't really know what that's supposed to be doing. And not to mention this niche, that's also completely a mystery. So it's a kind of hack job, I would say, that happens after Brunelleschi leaves the project. And I think it's important to note, again, just to emphasize what I was saying before about the ideal of Renaissance history that wants us to see these buildings as a kind of ideal, perfect execution of a theory, when in practice it was actually quite messy. One of the important theorists of this period who wrote down, recorded, and published some of these ideas, some of these theoretical ideas, was Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti was not trained as an architect, but he was someone who was well-versed in a wide range of disciplines. He studied history, he studied literature, he wrote novels and novellas, he was philosophy. He worked in the papal court, but also was a good friend. He was right in the middle of a circle of architects and artists, and he was a good friend of many architects and artists, and participated in their theoretical conversations, whereas his friends who were practitioners maybe didn't have the time or the inclination or the intellectual acumen to produce theoretical texts. Alberti did. And Alberti, because he was so learned, he was supposedly a really great conversationalist, he was often invited all over Italy to various courts in various cities to discuss the ideas of the day. And one of those courts was in Rimini, which is in western Italy, and he was commissioned, even though he didn't really have an architectural background, he was commissioned to give ideas for the completion of an important church in Rimini, the Church of San Francesco, which is dedicated to St. Francis. And sometimes you'll see this building referred to as the Tempio Malatestiano, because it was the main church of the Malatesta family, who were in charge in Rimini. There is a church that is already in existence. Alberti is called in to basically wrap this church in stone. Bless you. Wraps this church in stone, and this is an opportunity for him to put into practice his ideas about structural logic, tectonic logic, and the classical language as it should be applied to Renaissance churches. One of the key ways in which Alberti disagreed with his friend Brunelleschi had to do with the use of columns in architecture. Alberti observed that if a column is supposed to support an entablature, it's a kind of natural tectonic language for the column to support an entablature. However, he was really emphasizing the wall. The wall, remember, was an important, maybe the important architectural element in ancient Rome. And so Alberti, when he looked at arches, for example, he didn't see them as elements that should be supported by a column. He saw a wall. For Alberti, what was an arch? An arch was a wall that was punched, had an arch punched into it. And if you have a wall with an arch punched into it, what's left over is not a column. A column is round on its base. A wall is rectangular in plan, right? And so what Alberti said is that you should never have an arcade supported by a column, because it's unnatural, it's illogical to have a round element supporting a wall section that's going to be rectangular. You can see this really well in the flank of the building. So imagine if this whole wall were solid stone wall, and you made these arches by basically using a cookie cutter, and you punch the archway out of it. What's left is a pier, not a column. This is Alberti arguing for an even more rigorous structural logic than Brunelleschi was doing in his churches in Florence, where he emphasized the nave arcade. Here's a detail that allows you to see a little bit better the arrangement of that pier at the Tempio Malatestiana. Alberti himself also put this into practice at the Church of Sant'Andrea in Mantua in Italy. Here you have the plan on the top, on the bottom the interior of the church, and this interior should look very familiar to you. It's a long open nave, and there are these side spaces here, which were chapels. And instead of having a colonnade like an early Christian church or a Brunelleschian church, you have these massive piers. These chapels are connected by means of doorways, but they don't really read as an aisle in the traditional sense. You can't really read them as an aisle, as a circulation space. The chapels read as more discrete spatial elements, and you can see that in the plan too. And this should remind you, by the way, of the source of the source, the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. So this is a lineage of precedent that we've been talking about this semester. We begin with the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. We talked about how that basilica became a precedent for early Christian churches. It was interpreted into a church like San Paolo, which we saw a couple slides ago. San Paolo, that early Christian church with a nave arcade, informed Brunelleschi's church interior. And here we have Alberti. Alberti recommended going ad fontes, A-D, one word, fontes, F-O-N-T-E-S, back to the source, ad fontes. And so he goes to the source of the source. He goes all the way back to the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine. He interprets it, but you can really clearly see the source of the source here in his execution of the Church of Sant'Andrea in Mantua. And this is going to continue to be important. Next week we'll have an opportunity to talk about the Counter-Reformation Church Il Gesù in Rome. Sant'Andrea and the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine remains important into, it remains the model for church architecture until the mid-18th century. So Alberti, I was saying, was a great theorist. He was a great logician. He was very interested in logic and artistic and architectural systems, and he produced a publication called De Re Edificatoria. In English, it's been translated On the Art of Building, or you might see it referred to as On the Art of Building in 10 books. He wrote this text over a period of years, and eventually, after his death, it was printed. And it was the first architectural treatise that was printed. And that printing allowed it to be widely disseminated. after 1485. Because he was interested in ancient sources, he went back to the source of the first known architectural treatise in the West, Vitruvius's treatise called De Architectura, which dated from the 1st century CE. There are so many ways in which Alberti paid homage to Vitruvius in this text. Both treatises were organized in 10 chapters. Both of them talked about proportional and geometric systems that gave order to architecture. Important in the Albertian treatise is the way in which he tried to emphasize that buildings should observe what he called decorum. And decorum is a word that we use today. It tends to refer to accepted standards of behavior. You might think of it almost like manners or etiquette, how you behave in certain situations. So, for example, when you're out with your friends, you might behave one way. When you're at the dinner table with your grandmother, you might behave another way, right? So the place and the company and the circumstances determine how you behave. And Alberti said that the same should hold true for architecture. And so he set up these categories, these distinctions, or you might call them dichotomies. Dichotomies are two things that face off or oppose one another. And these categories or distinctions determine how a building should appear, what sort of standards should apply based on the condition or the situation. So, for example, he distinguished between an urban building and a rural building. An urban building is usually in a dense city. It's got close neighbors. It should respect those neighbors. It faces onto the street. It exposes itself to a broad audience. And it should respect that audience because it's in the public realm. And so it should never assert itself. It should always be sensitive and respond to, maybe it's with scale, maybe it's with material, maybe it's with the composition of the facade, but it should respect those parameters of the urban realm. And when you're in a room with more people or you're in a city with more buildings, that in order for everyone to coexist peacefully, that respect for the neighbor is really important. In the rural environment, of course, it's not so dense. You're in more isolation. And so a building in the rural environment had more freedom to be expressive. It could be more playful. It was often a more utilitarian structure. It might be used for farming, for example. So the expectations on a rural building were not so rigid and disciplined as they were for an urban building. Public and private is another dichotomy. The idea for a public building is that it should have features that tell people that the building is for them, that the building is for everyone. You can do that through the scale of the building. You can do that through the siting of the building. You can do that through the composition of the openings that allow people to come into the building, the approach to it, the articulation of a doorway. We talked about the use of windows, for example, on a town hall, which communicates that the building is at least figuratively or symbolically for everyone. It's a public building. As opposed to a private building is one that is probably for an individual or a family. And the language of that building should not give people the impression that they can just walk in off the street, right? So the scale of it determines that, the material might suggest that, the articulation of the openings from the street to the building would express that. Sacred versus secular. So a sacred building in this period is typically a church, and a secular building means that it's not religious. So a sacred building has certain, we've already talked at length about the way sacred buildings are used in this period, And those functions have to be expressed in the building. You don't perform religious rituals in your home. So your home shouldn't have forms that can be confused with those of a church. So these are ways in which, from the very beginning of the design process, Alberti is saying these are expectations that allow people in the built environment to make sense of what they're seeing, so that they know how to engage the built environment. If you adhere to these guidelines, the built environment will make sense. Alberti used some of his theories in other works of architecture, not just churches, but he also was commissioned to make a facade for the private home of a patron, Giovanni Rucellai, in Florence. And this is an interesting story, actually, because Giovanni Rucellai was the eldest brother of this important family in Florence. They were very wealthy. They had a lot of political power. And each of his brothers had adjacent properties to his. He decided that he wanted to buy out his brothers so that he could make a bigger splash on the street face, and he invited his brothers to sell to him their adjacent properties. One brother agreed. The other brother said, hell no, I'm not doing that. And they used this facade to knit together these properties that are not really as orderly and united as this facade suggests. Alberti applies this facade to kind of knit them together, and he's trying to think about the skin of the building, the organization of the building, and how those classical elements can articulate the order of the interior spaces, even though that order didn't exist behind that skin. And so what he does is he uses pilasters, the classical orders, and he applies them on the elevation with an order on the bottom that is, it's actually a Tuscan order, sort of like the Doric order, which is a heavier one, a Corinthian order here at the top, and then a composite order on the attic story up above, as a way of giving order, giving a kind of tectonic language, even though it's just a skin, to the facade of the building. Again, along those lines of the Renaissance being a period when things are not always resolved, I want to point your attention to the edge of the building over here, the right-hand edge of the building. Do you see how it's not finished? That's the brother who wouldn't sell his property. So there's another property on this side of the Palazzo Rucellai. That brother actually wrote in his will that not only would he not sell to Giovanni Rucellai, but none of his heirs could ever sell to any of the heirs of Giovanni Rucellai. He was really he really was angry and irritated about this whole thing. And so Giovanni Rucellai, the patron of Alberti here, leaves this thing unfinished as a way to kind of further irritate his brother, So it's the two of them really in this family feud at the edge of the building. And the one nice thing about this edge is that it really allows you to see how thin this skin really is. It's super, super thin. And so obviously, again, Alberti asking himself, what is the source for applying the classical order on a vertical elevation? He's going back to look at the Colosseum, where we saw this same system of application of classical orders with a Tuscan order on the bottom. Of course, at the Colosseum, they used an Ionic and then a Corinthian, so it's not exactly the same, but he obviously is thinking about a tectonic logic or logic of elevation that came from the ancient period. The Rucellai, like the Medici, they put their emblems on their projects. This is one of the Rucellai emblems, And it actually combines with an emblem of the Medici family because the Rucellai family married into the Medici family. So they combine them. There's a kind of ring and these feathers, and it's basically like putting your name on the building so that people not only know who commissioned the building, but also who their political alliances are. Alberti generated theories on the urban scale. You read about this some weeks ago in your assigned reading. This is the plan of the city of Pienza. And this is a place where historians have really conflicted over decades to try to understand the place of this city or this town. Really, it's a very tiny village, in fact. In the history of architecture, the project was initiated by Pope Pius II. His family was exiled from Siena to this town in the mid-15th century. Over time, one of the eldest sons of this family ascended the church hierarchy and ultimately became elected pope. And when he was elected pope, he said, right, I'm going back to my hometown. I'm going to show everyone that we are not defined by this shameful exile from Siena. We're going to put this town on the map. So in doing that, first of all, he renames the town. The town was originally called Corsignano. He renames it Pienza after his papal name, Pius II. And in the middle of the town, he collaborates with Alberti to kind of generate a scheme for the organization of the main institutional buildings in the city. Now, interestingly, Alberti, I think this is significant actually in thinking about Renaissance cities because historians have wanted to propose that Renaissance cities were all ideal, that they were all organized in this centralized way, if they were founded during the 15th or 16th century. Alberti actually said that the idea of a completely new town structured on an ideal plan is a big mistake. He said that cities are diverse places. Cities are places with lots of different people who have different status, who have different roles in society. They kind of serve different purposes in their society, and the city should reflect that diversity. It should be organized in a way that's more organic and that has variety. This idea of variety, in Latin, varietas, it was a concept that he really, really emphasized, and he said that if you impose too strictly an ordering system on a city from the beginning, it reads like a totalitarian or dictatorial organization. And he definitely was, he wanted to be democratic. He wanted the city to be for the people. And so this notion of variety was really important to him. If you're looking at this plan, you may be thinking I'm crazy talking about this idea of variety because it looks fairly ordered, doesn't it? But if you look closely at it, you'll see that Alberti and the person who executes it in reality, the architect Rossellino, you actually see Alberti's theory in practice in a couple of different ways. Here are the buildings on this site. First of all, you have the Papal Palace, which is here. It's called the Palazzo Piccolomini. Piccolomini was the name of the Pope. You can just call it the Papal Palace if you're asked to refer to it. I don't expect you to know this name, Piccolomini. Which is kind of hard to say. And you can see that it's massive. If you look at the footprint, you can see that it really dominates the urban space. It's because the Pope is the main patron here. He's the main mover. The attention is really on him. The language of his building, of his palace, is domestic. If you look at the plan of it, it's a domestic building. So it's a private building, and it's a secular building. In comparison with the cathedral is a religious building. Its form reveals that it's a religious building, and it's a public building. There are palaces on either side here. They're smaller. They're for other religious leaders, but not as important as the Pope. So the scale is smaller. So just the variety of these buildings around the main square here adheres to, or is faithful to, Alberti's idea of variety, or varietas. And this building over here is the town hall. It's like this little itty bitty thing. You can tell that there maybe is a communal government here, but like they're not that important in comparison with all of these religious institutions. So the scale and the language of the buildings, the siting of the buildings, is key in communicating the roles, the appropriate identity of each of these buildings. Interestingly, I was saying that historians have feuded over the importance and the characterization of this place for decades. Many historians have wanted to see this as an ideal city. It is not an ideal city. This is the plan of the city. You can see that it's highly organic. The streets are sort of labyrinthine. There's a very loose grid. Yes, there's kind of a grid, but it's fairly loose. And the fabric of the city is very distinctive. It's very varied. There's one main artery that runs through the city. You can see here it's called Corso Rossolino. It runs from east to west, from east to west. And in order to kind of fit this narrative of Renaissance perfection, really before the 1990s, historians insisted on representing this main square from an ideal viewing point right about here, so that the view of the church and the view of these palaces framed a kind of perfect urban room. You guys can look at this city plan and you know that it's highly artificial to suggest that anyone is going to put their body in that perfect viewpoint. Even the street approaching it from here, look at how it's not even really a straight artery or a straight axis to get there. And it throws you out into the piazza off axis. So this is again a case of historians wanting to idealize this period that is actually a lot more complicated. And I'll come back to these views in a second, but this is actually how you experience this space. This is that street, Corso Rossolino. You're on that main street, you're going east to west. And the way this piazza and the surrounding buildings present themselves to you is by kind of jutting out into the line of your circulation. This is the facade of the Papal Palace. So it turns to greet you. It basically obstructs that axis of the Corso Rossolino. So this is, I think, more consistent with Alberti's idea of variety and the idea that a city should have a much more organic and distinctive experience rather than an idealized experience. So just to kind of go back over some of these buildings so that you can see what they look like in the space. This is the piazza itself. This is the facade of the building, clearly articulating that this is a sacred building. This is a secular building. Based on the languages of these buildings, if I had not told you anything about them, and you ended up in this piazza, you would know that. And it's because of the language of the buildings. Here's a detail of the palace, the Papal Palace. Very clear, emphatic entry, but there's only one entry. It's not like that entry that the lower level of this building is so open that it's inviting the public in. It announces that it's a private building. It only has these two entrances, one on the piazza and one on the street. And this is the town hall. So I love this town hall because it articulates or presents a lot of the same language of town hall that we've looked at in other cases, but obviously really, really diminished, really small in scale, and very simplified, so that you understand that the secular powers in this town are not as significant as the religious powers. Are there any questions on the Albertian theory, the ideas about church architecture, this urban planning project. Okay. So, let's see, I'm actually gonna change the order here. I want to next kind of dig into a topic that I've already kind of hinted at with our discussion of the Palazzo Rucellai and also the Papal Palace in Pienza, and that is domestic architecture in the Renaissance. And we tend to call these buildings palazzi. Remember that a palazzo can be a private residence for an individual family. It's not just an institutional building, so it can sometimes be a little bit confusing in the nomenclature. What I'm showing you here is a precursor to later Renaissance palace architecture, domestic architecture. This is the Palazzo Davanzati in Florence, dating from the 14th century. This was a house for a single family. And I want to say that those of you who study abroad, if you end up going to Florence, this is a building that is not, it's not a building that like shows up on the major tourist, itinerary, but it's a kind of house museum where they've reconstructed what the interior of the building might have looked like when people were living in it. And it's a really rare opportunity to see the interior of a building like this. So I really recommend seeing it. You can tell that this period, the 14th century and even earlier, was a period during which there was a lot of infighting between families. There was a lot of competition, political competition between families, so that this house looks a little bit more fortified than the Palazzo Rucellai that we were just looking at, or the Palazzo Piccolomini, the Papal Palace in Pienza. It's a very tall building, and it's almost like a compound in the sense that an extended family would have lived in this building. The lowest zone, it's a precursor to later residences in Florence and in Rome, because this lowest zone was more public. And it looks more public, right? You can see that it's got these big openings. They would have been open, back in the day. And it's partly because this lower zone of palaces tended to be used for business. So the family would have their residence above and their business below. And it would be this lower zone on the bottom. And the private aspect of the building up above, which is where the family lived, you can read that through the size of the windows and the stories up above. And because these buildings were such a strong, heavy block structure, you needed to find a way to get light and air into this building. So usually there is a courtyard carved into the middle of the building. The vertical circulation goes around that courtyard. And sometimes at the top, there's a loggia. And it's another great reason why it's worth visiting here, because the view from up here, you get a really special view of the city, an unusual view from that loggia up at the top of the building. On the right here, I'm showing you an interior room from the Palazzo Davanzati. This was a bedroom, and it's frescoed on the walls with a pattern that recalls the pattern of tapestries. It was not unusual to hang tapestries, carpets on the walls to keep them warm. Here we have them decorating the walls with a kind of fictive painted tapestry. And up above, I'm just going to lower the lights for a second so you can see the fresco a little bit better. I'll bring the lights up in a second. The images around the top of the room are images that are about a courtly romance between a woman and her lover, and her role as a virtuous woman who is absolutely faithful to her lover. The story goes all around the top of this room, and it's kind of divided into scenes by these arches. It's not for nothing that this theme is included in the bedroom. Of course, the bedroom was often a place where works of art were usually intended to educate the woman almost never the man, but educate the woman about the importance of virtue and faithfulness and her duty as the mother, as the female head of the family. So the Palazzo Davanzati is a kind of precursor to later Renaissance palaces. So we talked a little bit about the Palazzo Rucellai. The Palazzo Rucellai post-dates, it comes after another important palace in Florence, which basically redefined the form of the single-family home in Florence and eventually also in Rome. So the Palazzo Medici, you can read it from this view. It's actually a helpful view to kind of reflect what the original source for this building type was. Rather than emphasizing a kind of fortified, vertical, tower-like structure, like what we saw in the Palazzo Davanzati, instead, the Palazzo Medici is a freestanding block, and it has much more in common with the Roman domus. Remember the domus plan, which is this freestanding, or not always freestanding, but it's a kind of block form with important family spaces organized around a core, an atrium. This obviously is the model for the Palazzo Medici and other palazzi that come after it. Again, the Medici were bankers, they were extremely wealthy, but they were not just sort of bourgeois, nouveau riche types. They were highly educated, and they wanted to reflect their education, their erudition, their connection to culture, their patronage through the use of these classical sources. So here are the Medici looking back to the classical past, this domus model, and they asked the architect to kind of interpret that for their purposes. The site of the Palazzo Medici is no accident. Their family had been based in a northern quarter of Florence for a very long time. When it came time to build this building, they sited it on the most important artery into the city from the northernmost gate of the city. So what happens is, if you have the city of Florence, the very northern gate of the city, you enter into the city and you come into the city center on this street. Before you ever get to the cathedral, before you ever get to the town hall, you pass this building. And look at how the building turns its face into the street so that you cannot avoid it. When I'm emphasizing the fact that it's on the northernmost artery, think about who would be coming from the north. We're in Florence, we're in northern Italy. Any imperial power would be coming from the north. Any person who's coming from a major court, Milan, Mantua, Ferrara, Venice, all those people are coming in from the north. So what would happen is diplomats who were coming to visit the city, even though it was a democracy, even though it was a commune, and there was this democratically elected government, everybody knew by the time this building was built that the Medici were in charge. It wasn't as if they were dukes, it wasn't if they had a title, but everyone knew that the Medici were in charge. And those diplomats who would enter the city stopped here first. They would stop at this building before they ever went into the city center to the cathedral or to the town hall. And the siting, the language of the building, emphasizes this fact of the Medici really being the people who were pulling the strings in Florence. They announced their power through the material of the exterior of the building. It's highly fortified, you can see. They use this very heavy stone, very like the stone that was used on the facade of the town hall, the Palazzo Vecchio. The organization of the interior communicates that public lower zone is very heavy. The stone is cut in a way that's very heavy. It's because the street was a filthy, disgusting, dirty, violent place. It's not refined. The upper zones of the building show the refinement of the city. As it ascends, the stonework, the masonry becomes more and more refined. They put their coat of arms right on the corner of the building so that you know it's sort of like a big sign saying who lives there. These openings on the bottom are because the Medici did run their bank through the base, that ground floor level of their building. Eventually, in the 16th century, when they do take over the city as dukes, they ask Michelangelo to fill in those arches. So you have to imagine it in some sense being open in the 15th century. Other aspects of the classicizing language of the facade here is this heavy cornice that you see, and also these brackets on the outside, which really descend from a classical language of domestic architecture. Here's the plan. You can read it really clearly. The approach to this building opens you into this courtyard, which is a place of kind of private reception. The bank area would have been on the bottom floor, of course, but to get up into the private zone of the building, there's just really, this stair over here actually came later. There's just this one stair initially that is a kind of public stair that would conduct you up to the upper zones of the building. Here's a comparison with a generic domus plan, just to remind you of that relationship and the kind of precedent that Michelozzo was looking at in the design of this building. And this is the courtyard on the inside. You can see that the language of the inside of this building is much more refined than the very rough exterior. And so again, thinking about the theory of the day and how the language of the architecture should reflect the condition. Is it public? Is it private? Is it sacred? Is it secular? And so the language of this interior is much more refined, more open. And unusually, in the back of this building, there's a little garden. And the Medici would use this garden to welcome thinkers of the day, authors, historians, literary people. They would have great intellectual debates here, and they even sometimes referred to it as a Medician academy that would meet in the garden in the back of the Palazzo Medici. Palazzo, the language of Palazzo architecture did differ from place to place, and I wanted, while we were talking about the Palazzo, I wanted to show an example from Venice, where obviously the building conditions are quite different. We didn't really talk about the building method in Renaissance Venice when I introduced the Palazzo Ducale and the Basilica of San Marco, and it really is a very interesting approach that they took. In order to build in the marshland of the lagoon, the Venetians had to first bring basically tree trunks from the mainland. They look like telephone poles, or like pencils. They look like big telephone poles with points on the bottom. They would have to fell these trees. They'd have to harvest the trees, and they'd have to cut them into this shape. They would literally ship them to the lagoon. These pilings, they're called pilings, they would be driven down into the mud of the lagoon, and on top of them, they would make like a platform. On top of that, they would lay a horizontal surface of stone. That stone surface was like the platform or the foundation for almost every building in Venice. And above that stone platform, they tended to build in brick. Most of these buildings are built in brick because brick was very light and it would have been very easy to transport. Okay? And so they build the building in brick, but they face it in stone. So anytime you see a stone building in Venice, it should not indicate to you that the whole building is built in stone. It's always a revetment, it's always a skin. And this building, the Ca' d'Oro, was built in the 15th century. It was called the Golden House because It's gone today, but it had actual gilding on the facade of the building. And you can see here many of the attributes that we associate with Venetian architecture. A kind of system of arches that are pointed, or even OG arches that look more like Eastern arches that we might see in the Middle East, rather than a kind of Roman classical vocabulary. We see a variety of colors, this play of whitish gray marble and pink marble, and also this patterning, this very careful stone cutting. All of these things make this a kind of local Venetian version of the palazzo. You would never see this particular language anywhere else in Italy unless it was in the Venetian territory. The facade of this building tells us a little bit about the site conditions. If we think about the Palazzo Medici, I told you that it was a block with a core of the courtyard basically stamped out of the middle of it. In Venice, you don't have the luxury of just taking up a ton of space and carving out a courtyard in the middle of the building. Every square inch is difficult to build, and you have to make the most out of a very small site. And so in Venice, as a way of getting light and air into the building, rather than making a courtyard from the top down in the middle of the building, they open a core from the front to the back. And this space, and you can read it actually on the facade, where this is that core that runs from the front to the back, and the more private spaces are on the side here. Obviously, the lower zone, again, is a place that is more public. It's open to the water. Like in other cities in Venice, that lower zone tended to be a commercial zone. It was a place where boats would offload materials. Sometimes if the person was a trader, they would use that lower zone as a warehouse to store goods. So that lower zone is a kind of open private zone, and the upper zone, the lower zone is public and the upper zone is private. So here's a plan. That core that runs from the front to the back is called a portico. Here's the spelling of it, P-O-R-T-E-G-O, a portico, from the front to the back. And this is a space that was often used for reception or for social events. It tended to be the most open, hospitable space within the building. Unusually, this particular building does have a courtyard, and it tells you a little bit about the power of the family that originally owned this building, the Zen family. They were extremely wealthy. The names that you see here, Giovanni and Bartolomeo Bon, they were the architects, and so they have this massive stair that bypasses the warehouse zone on the bottom altogether, going up to the private zones of the building. This is that lowest zone, that warehouse zone. It's pretty stunning, actually, to see the stonework on the floor of this area. Remember that this is a part of the building that would often be flooded. The water would actually come in and inundate this part of the building. So you had to have a material on the floor of this space that would stand up to the water. This is the view from the upper zone of that portico looking out to the Grand Canal of the city. And so you get a little bit of a sense of how it can bring the light and the air into the building. This is a great place for people to see a view of the city. Of course, it was also, you have to remember that the Grand Canal was like the main street, so it was also a place where people could be seen. They could be seen in the context of their palace, and yet they could also see out to the city from the privacy of their own home. I'm going to stop there, and then on Tuesday we're finally going to make our way to Rome. We'll look at the new sacristy in Florence, and then look at the development of 16th century Rome.